Hello, my name's Michael Gallagher. I'm in charge of painting conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm here in Brisbane and we've just finished installing this incredibly beautiful exhibition of paintings from the Met. Very exciting after a long period of planning to see them finally on the wall. There's been very many months of planning, some of it administrative, but for the conservation, a lot of preparation. We wanted these works to come looking their best, but also to travel safely and responsibly. That means that, say, panels are put in what we call Marvel seal envelopes. They're an enclosure that prevents them being subject to any fluctuations in humidity or temperature during transportation. Frames are looked at. Many of these paintings have very old frames, and there's always a danger that if they're not properly consolidated, something could happen on the way. So my colleagues have put in weeks and weeks of work to make sure these pictures that are very precious to us arrive safely, and we're delighted that they have. But today I'd like to concentrate on one painting, because sometimes I think thinking about an individual picture says so much about all of them. And it's a picture that's very dear to me because I conserved it in 2009, and it's the one that's over my shoulder now, a portrait of a man by Velázquez. This painting entered the collection in 1949, and it had an interesting history even up to then. At one point, it was in a German collection as a Van Dyck. And then in the 1920s, the dealer Joseph de Veen had bought the painting, and I think somewhat as a speculation, and he had it cleaned and had the leading Hispanist of his day look at it, who declared it definitely by Velázquez. He wrote about it in a way that was very compelling. But what happened was de Veen had the painting restored beyond correcting damages in the paint layer. The picture is unfinished, or it's never been brought, I should say, to a high finish. They toned everywhere in the background that was a little thin or a little brushy. Also, the sitter had been painted more full on, and then the artist changed the position of the head. And so there was what we call a pentimento, a change of mind, somewhat visible on the painting surface. That was suppressed. So all of those changes slightly deadened the picture. It entered the collection just over 20 years later. It wasn't worked on, but in the intervening years, it was varnished a number of times with a variety of varnishes, some natural resin, which would go a little maybe brown over time, and some synthetic resin, which tend to get a little gray and milky. By the 1970s, it was demoted to sort of follower of. And I came across something that was interesting, that before it was treated, someone had described the background as green. It had so shifted in color and just was sort of dead as a doornail, really. When I first came to the museum, Metropolitan Museum in 2005, I walked through the collection with the chief curator, Keith Christiansen, and it was a picture that he'd always kept on view because he felt it had some quality. And he said, "Do you think it might improve with treatment?" I'd been working on a Velázquez from the Frick collection, and it seemed like a good moment to take this one in hand and have a closer look. I did a test cleaning, and I was amazed at the level of discoloration of all those coatings that were on from the 20s onwards. And it became very clear as those were removed that this was a very different sort of portrait. It wasn't a highly finished portrait. It was a spirited sketch from life. The background was summery. Velázquez at this point in his career is using a sort of grayish pink ground layer. That's the paint layer that's put over the entire canvas prior to beginning painting. And a lot of that is showing through everywhere. Similarly, the hair, which he changed during the course of changing the position, was not fully resolved in places. The clothing, the doublet or the jacket he's wearing, is not rendered in a very, very detailed way. It's painterly. It's just the right amount of information for you to suggest the form, but it's not labored. all of the attention goes on the face. And the faces and the expression, I think, stops you in your tracks. It's a deep concentration. I think it's very hard to walk past this picture without engaging with the sitter. The portrait was laid in on the ground layer I described, that pinkish grey ground layer. The artist used quite a loose brush line drawing in a sort of blackish brown paint to indicate all the position of the body, the main forms in the face. He then built up that those forms with sort of fluid layers of more of that brown blackish paint, almost like not quite a glaze, but as an under-modeling, playing back and forth between where the contour ended and where the background began. The actual clothing is just executed in black with a little white added for grey tones. All of the concentration is on the forms of the face, and also I think the quality of light playing off the flesh tones. Again, building up with sort of opaque and semi-opaque paint layers, adding pinkish highlights, adding some dark tones around the eyes, sensational mustache that sweeps out left and right, and capturing in a remarkable way the sense of, I think, I always feel you know the temperature in that room. There's a slight effect of moisture just under the eyes, on the tip of the nose, and that gaze is a gaze of interrogation. The painting was known, even when there was a question over whether it was truly by Velázquez or not, it was known to relate to a figure on the far right of a very famous painting that is in the Prado in Madrid, The Surrender of Breda, which Velázquez had executed in the 1630s, and which documented a very important event in recent history at that time. There is a figure on the far right. He's wearing a hat, but it's unmistakably this gentleman here. So the question had always been, who is that? Some people feel it's impossible that Velázquez could have put himself into that historic painting, that record of an important moment. But he's somewhat separated from the action in the painting by a very large horse. And at that point, Velázquez had been painting for the court for over 10 years, and he was an ambitious man. If you were to take this portrait and compare it to, say, there's a painting in Valencia from a few years later, and he's a little older, he's a little heavier set, but there are features that I think are very distinctive. He has really pronounced sort of bone structure above his brows that are rather pronounced. His nose comes down, it flares out at the bridge. It has a very sort of faceted end to the tip of the nose. And you see that very clearly in the Valencia portrait. I also feel that interrogation is you see a lot in that gaze. Is something you see very much in self-portraits when someone is looking very hard. There's another little feature that the brush line, where he laid out the main features of the portrait, he made very few changes. He did change the position of the head, but the one line he cancels out is in the bottom left corner of the picture. And I think that's his palette arm raised. And he would have just been looking in the mirror, painting quite rapidly, but that one he pulls the background over to sort of get rid of the evidence in a way. I feel very strongly that this is a self-portrait, which makes it all the more compelling to me. It is full of, I was going to say painterly flourishes, but there's something about Velázquez that flourish sounds too trivial. He just has an incredible hand-eye-brain connection. The color is probably painted in a matter of seconds. You can almost count the brush strokes that create both the form, the position. You can almost feel the starch in the collar. Everywhere, I mean, I always say to people that you can break down, as I have tried to do, the steps in creating that portrait, but that doesn't mean you can really understand it. It doesn't mean you can reproduce it. He's a man who's a dazzling facility with a brush, but it's an intelligent facility and it's not slick. I hope people will come and look at this painting closely and make up their own mind. I'm delighted that it's universally accepted now as a work by Velázquez. The Prado actually borrowed it to hang next to the Surrender of Breda, which was a very wonderful moment. Is it Velázquez? Isn't it? I think everyone's entitled to a viewpoint on that. I hope this short insight into the complexity of one painting in this exhibition will encourage you to come and see all of them in person. I hope with this portrait you'll ask the question yourself, who are you? I think you'll likely get an answer. One of the joys about paintings is it's always an interactive experience if you take the time, stop in front of it, look at it, and ask those questions in your mind. What makes this so compelling for me? What doesn't make it so compelling for me? What makes this exciting? What makes it boring? Each time you do that, you build a relationship. And long after these paintings have returned to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you will remember them, and to some degree, you'll own them.